Thank you. Dear colleagues, I'm glad to see all of you here on our seminar, which is happily already the fourth seminar in a series of PoSoCoMeS online seminars, and we are happy to see you here. And of course, all of you are kindly invited also to join the next seminars in our series. All the details and schedule you may find on our webpage, PoSoCoMeS.org. I'm Mary Matskevich, and I'm honored to chair today's seminar. My role will be very modest. I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then I'll tell just a few words about the seminar's timing, and then I'll pass the floor to Professor Isa Ding. Today's exciting topic is Chairman Mao's children, generation, and the politics of memory in China. And we are grateful that Dr. Ping Xu from the Emory University and Dr. Isa Ding from the University of Pittsburgh agreed to share their ideas and insights with us. Let me introduce the speakers with more details. Bin Xu is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, US. His research covers cultural sociology, political sociology, and China studies, as well as collective memory studies. He is the author of The Politics of Compassion, The Sichuan Earthquake and Civic Engagement in China, published in 2017 by Stanford University Press. And the book received the Mary Douglas Prize for Best Book in the Sociology of Culture and honorable mention for Best Book on Asia Transnational from the American Sociological Association in 2018. And his next book was The Culture of Democracy, a sociological approach to civil society, hopefully forthcoming with Polity Press. And he is also author of numerous articles appearing in leading journals in sociology and China studies. Professor Xu is also a recipient of many awards and grants, and one of the Public Intellectual Program Fellows at the National Committee on US-China Relations. And Professor Xu will be in conversation with Professor Isa Ding. Isa Ding is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research explores the antinomias emerging through economic and political modernization, such as development and environmentalism, bureaucracy and populism, and liberalism and nationalism. Her articles have appeared or are forthcoming in Comparative Political Studies, China Quarterly, Chinese Political Science Review, Democratization, Studies in Comparative and International Development, and World Politics. Her book, The Performative State, is forthcoming from Cornell University Press. Just a few words how the seminar in general will go. It will last from 1 hour and a half up to 2 hours, depending on how many questions we will have. So please, you can start writing down your questions on the chat box on Zoom, and we'll collect your questions and then ask them to the presenters. And of course, this is, again, I need to say that you are all welcome to join our next seminars, which take place on first Mondays of each month at the same time, which is 5:30 p.m. by Central European time, here with the same link. So you all are welcome. And Professor Ding, the floor is yours, and I'm listening very attentively to the presentations, to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this seminar. And obviously, it's my great honor to be discussing this book. So Dr. Xu's research has inspired my own, including his previous book, The Politics of Compassion. And when this new book came out, I've been waiting to read it. So that's when I got the email, I immediately said yes, because that would be my opportunity to actually read the book. So no need to say that it was a really great read, and it's a really thought-provoking book. And this is, this is an area I also do research on myself, nostalgia and communist nostalgia and collective memory. So this book has certainly enriched my own understanding. And so for this reason, I'm really grateful for this opportunity and for the organizers and for Dr. Xu. So I thought, before I kind of get into the nitty-gritty, I just want to say that this research itself makes a really great contribution to our to not only kind of sociology, but I also think history and collective memory and so forth, because I was reading this, I was thinking about we now live in this age of overabundance of data. And if we think about how things are going to be remembered in 50, 100 years, on one hand, it seems like, history or sociology of history or these things we're doing could be obsolete, because all we need to do is just to, put our data on the cloud, and then the AI or intelligent machine that in the future can just kind of analyze this data, and then that would be history, and a very, very new way of doing history. And obviously, I think I suspect that many people envision that to be the future of history or even sociology. So, and then I was reading this book and I was just thinking about, we do have this, overabundance of data now, but we do also have this, it's kind of ironically that we also will be living in an era with the dearth of narratives, because we'll have a lot of data, and then perhaps because we have a lot of data, and then we're going to neglect narratives. And I think, this is less of an issue for historical memory, and then for a piece of research looking into the past, because for the past and for something like the Cultural Revolution or the Maoist era or the Communist era, we do still lack data. So even kind of collecting memory before it fades is a really important enterprise. But kind of even thinking about looking into the future, this book just reminds me of how important narrative is, even when we will have a lot of data to analyze. And this book has many, many really great and interesting insights, and then too many to be listed. And I'll just, I think in my remarks, touch upon a few of them. And I think, because I read the kind of going backwards, I really like this idea that nostalgia is a luxury, which is something that I, haven't thought of in my own research. And I think it's only when you, when this book kind of does this thing, not only talking to people, but also looking at the commercialization of nostalgia, kind of going to these field sites and then following these people on these trips, and do you realize that not everybody gets to do that, and nostalgia to some extent is a luxury. So I thought that was really interesting. And then I also like how this book really does justice to the complexity of historical memory. And I like how you kind of separate memory into personal memory, political memory, and collective memory. And I think those are, concepts that exist out there and are things that kind of we think about a lot, but I really like how this book kind of systematically gets into this, and obviously beyond these three dimensions, but those three kind of really stood out to me, and I really like how you treat each of them seriously, and then really look into where they overlap and where they come into conflict with one another. And methodologically, I thought it's really, at least for a political scientist, and then perhaps this is less of an innovation and invention for sociologists or for people who study history and memory. I thought it was really innovative to see kind of combination of interviews, in-depth interviews, and literary analysis and field side visits. And I don't know, I mean, perhaps I haven't read too much on this, but I do feel like this is really an innovation, because it just shows you that you're kind of really trying to get the whole story. And you're not just, for my own research, I did interviews. I did a bunch of in-depth interviews over the years with people and trying to understand this, communist nostalgia and historical memory. But I didn't, I would go to nostalgia shops for my own kind of curiosity, but I never did this, following these people on these trips and then and observing them really kind of ethnographically, and then going into these sites of nostalgia and thinking about them critically. So I thought that was really, at least for me, it was both informative and it was helpful. So I'll bring up in my remarks just several reflections and then kind of further questions for Dr. Xu. Some of them are about the theory, and then some are about methods, and then some are just kind of my future, my questions that I think maybe could be used to anchor our discussion in the next hour and a half, and then just for kind of stimulating a conversation amongst our participants of this workshop. Just kind of, I try to categorize my comments into several domains. I had some thoughts and questions about the theory of memory, and some questions, thoughts about class, and then some about methods. But I think because of this informal nature of our discussion, I'll just apologize if some of my questions and thoughts kind of are more stream of consciousness than structured. So starting with memory, and I really like how you separated this personal experience dimension from the historical evaluation dimension. So in other words, memory of one's own past and memory of the collective past. So I thought that was really clarifying, because it was something that really confused and perplexed me in my own research. And in the book kind of finds consistency in some, such as the stories of Lu and Yang in chapter 2, and then it also finds inconsistency in others. So I thought that was really clarifying. I wonder if you could say more about how you arrived at your typology. So in my own research, I also did this thing, trying to typologize my subjects into different types. In my own research, I look at, these people who are nostalgic, and then they're not nostalgic, and so on and so forth. And I like how you, and then a problem I experienced, obviously, is that there's more to that. It always feels like there's more to that. I obviously had less types than you did in this book, but I wonder if you can say more about how you arrived at this typology in the first place. So including, double ascending, contentment of, and with ambiguity, with uncertainty, and so on and so forth. So, so I wonder, if you, so another thought I had was, I noticed you kind of categorize personal experience into positive and negative. And do you think, what do you think about kind of separating or categorizing personal experience back then and now? And then, so I think this is also kind of woven into the typology, but I think, one confusion I've always had is, how do we think about, because all we can collect now is their memory. And then, when somebody tells us about how they're doing now, we kind of treat that as more objective. And then when people tell us how they were doing back then, and then we treat that as more kind of subjective and more as memory. And if I wonder if you could say more about, is it possible for us to kind of think about, there is this kind of objective domain of how people are doing now and back then. And then there's this kind of subjective domain of how they're thinking, evaluating their status now and back then, and then how those kind of bleed into each other and how they inform each other. So I think your typology, again, is very informative, but I wonder if you could kind of just puzzle through for us a bit. And then also, would you say that people's evaluation and of their, and talking about kind of the in-depth interviews you did, it seems like one thing that stood out to me is that it seems like people's evaluation of their own experience and character tends to be overwhelmingly positive. So, regardless of what happened to them, how they're doing now, how they were doing then, there's a way of kind of, portraying the story to be, to reflect kind of a positive personal character, either, either it's kind of, I'm a good person, I got screwed, or like I had this really, in my character of endurance, which means I was able to overcome this. So any of your subjects kind of reflected kind of negatively on themselves, or kind of blamed themselves in a sense for not working harder, or kind of blamed on themselves for even, I don't know if any of them kind of revealed to you that they were red guard and then talked about that experience kind of critically, just kind of for my curiosity. I like how you treated gender really seriously in one part of this interview chapters, and I think we typically use that, and especially the quantitative research kind of use that as a variable. And I think I like how here you kind of treat this more seriously, had a full-on discussion of that. I really like so I think it was really clarifying when you say that people's present condition shapes their retrospective views of their personal experience during the movement. But then their class status in the past kind of shape the historical evaluation of the program. Again, just want to say like how clarifying this finding is for me. And nevertheless, I think I'm still seeing this kind of paradox in memory that emerged for me, myself, during my own research, but something that I'm still thinking about reading this book, which is, people who are not doing well now, they could either blame this on what happened then to them then, right? So if they are seeing their life trajectory in this coherent sense, then it's kind of, people like this will have a very deterministic, fatalistic view of the world, and then seeing kind of what, blaming their conditions now to what happened then, back then, regardless of, their actual experience. Or people who are not doing well can become nostalgic for the past. So they could say, you know, whatever, regardless of what happened in the past, it was better. And then now, and especially considering that we tend to be nostalgic for our youth. So which is something I think, you know, I saw in my own research, and then saw, you know, you would see in these movies and TV shows for communist nostalgia in China. And a big part of that is kind of nostalgia for youth, regardless of how your experience was. So I think this paradox in memory is that, you know, and similarly, kind of if you're doing well now, you could both. And I think this is perhaps the least likely in our in the situations, that people who are doing well now, perhaps most of them would say that's because of, you know, their own character, their own hard work. And I think this came out really clearly in the book, is that if you're doing well now, regardless of whether you're actually doing well because if you're a princeling, or you know, you're doing well because you really suffered back then, regardless of, you know, how you actually got where you are today, you tend to say that's because of my own hard work. You know, and so I think that's perhaps the better, it's more clear for people who are doing well now. But then I think maybe we can talk more about this group of people who are really suffering now, and then thinking about their memory. And then whether you see this kind of also as a paradox, as I do, is that you could either blame history for causing you your pain now, or you could say, you know, you just turn away from the present and you say, you know, I'm nostalgic for the past. You know, the past was really great. Or perhaps I think, you know, maybe this depends on how they felt like they did, or how they actually did during the Cultural Revolution. So if they had a good time during the Cultural Revolution, and then they tend to become nostalgic, and if they didn't do well, then they blame what happened then. So then I want to move on to class, which is related to, I think I sort of started talking about class already. I thought, again, I think it's interesting that your findings that historical evaluation, this is kind of, we're moving away from evaluation of their personal experience, but evaluation of history, which is a separate dimension from evaluation of their personal experience. Again, I think important a point that the book makes. So historical evaluation cannot be explained by class status in the present. Again, I thought this was really interesting. It doesn't really correlate with how they're doing now. And I think, you know, one question I had, which I think you also touched upon in your discussion, which is kind of, how do we understand class in the Mao era? And would you say that people's fate, you know, and I think, you know, looking back at history and memory, it's more of a blur, but because it's a blur, it's also more simplified. And I think, again, you kind of really do justice to the complexity of both history and memory here. But still, I feel like, you know, it's, or perhaps it is true that back then, you know, people's experience were largely decided by their class status, and I think that's very much true. But I also thought, you know, during the Cultural Revolution, especially you know, you had the first kind of the more anarchic stage, and then you had the purges for after the 3 years, and then you do mention that you know, in the way the Cultural Revolution was to resolve the kind of class tension emerging in the early Mao era. So in the early Mao era, you had this really rigid class structure where, you know, children from the good class backgrounds were promoted, and then they could advance, and then children from the bad class background couldn't advance. And then in the sense that people really participated in the Cultural Revolution, and because they were upset with this. So then you do see a bit of kind of the class reversal during the early stage of the Cultural Revolution. And then you had the, the reversal of the reversal, where people split into factions, both claiming to be the good class in the kind of the second stage of the first stage of the Cultural Revolution. And then you had the sand down, and then you had the purges, and then you had, obviously the eventual eventual kind of resolution after the end of the Cultural Revolution. So thinking about this period, I think there is so much kind of reversal of fortune going on, and so it was less clarifying when I think about how do we think about class during this period. And then, when these people look back at their class background, are they talking about kind of class for the class label that they got before the Cultural Revolution, or do they see this like reversal of fortune, changing class during the Cultural Revolution? So I just wonder if you might clarify that a bit for us when we kind of talk about class during this period, and then whether perhaps it's true that it's more simple than I thought. Kind of thinking about this period, and then lastly on kind of on memory, and I was wondering if you might just comment a bit on this idea of memory and studying of memory itself, and then what are some of the lingering puzzles you have, and what are some of the lingering questions you still have about the either study of memory, research on memory, or this particular historical episode, any unresolved mysteries and questions that you're still trying to puzzle through. And I'm really curious, because the more, at least for me, the more I think about this question, the more I work on this question, the more I talk to people, the more confused I get. So I wonder if you could talk, just kind of reflect a bit more on this, your understanding of memory, and you don't have to kind of just answer my specific question, but just any thoughts you might have, any reflections you had. What was clarifying about this research experience for you about memory, and what made you even more puzzled, and as we kind of look back to these historical memory, again, the past is a blur. Do you think we and our subjects have this tendency to kind of treat the past more as a uniform experience? Is the past more of an illusion from a distance, or kind of how do we, should we just, stop thinking about, and obviously I think many people in working at history would say that, right? Should we stop thinking about, past as there's this objective past, and then there's this memory, and this kind of dichotomy between the objective and the subjective. And obviously I think the fields of sociology has moved beyond that. But I wonder if you might comment a bit on that. And then, or if you, and also I have many questions, and so you don't have to answer them all, but for a political scientist, I wondered about these people's evaluation of political evaluations of both kind of contemporary politics and Mao. And in my own research, I tried to kind of correlate memory with how they evaluate present politics, and then whether their evaluation of politics will be consistent, or whether they would, for instance, people who are nostalgic for the Maoist era, do they really, see kind of Xi as this, person who would kind of resolve their who will make China great again, for the lack of better terms. So that's something that I think you touched upon over and over in this book, but I wonder if you could, if there is any, systematic answer that we can get from this, and then some thoughts on methodology, and I wonder, again, those are not critiques, but just my own curiosity. First, I really like how you said that the presence of the observer in the ethnographic encounter is not noise, but music. So I thought that was really cool. And I really like this line, which I might cite in my own research in the future if I ever get to use ethnography again. But if you could say more about kind of how you enter the field, find your first subject, how did you find the rest of your subjects, and the interview process, and kind of just for my own curiosity, and especially working on something like this, is that the whole population is your potential subject. So one can get quite lost in trying to find their subjects and then trying to decide how to approach it. And I think in a sense that going I don't know if you kind of found the groups first, or if you started with the individual, because when I got to the end of the book, I thought, when I did this research, I started with the individual, but perhaps it's if you start with the groups, then, the snowball rolls faster. And so I thought, if you could talk more about this for us. And then let me see if I have any. Another question I thought methodologically is if you could comment on this method of typology. And I think in your typology really try to do justice to the complexity of memory. When I in my own research, I also typologized, and I think I started with 2 types and it became 4 types, and then you have more types. But then as I read this book, I wonder if you can comment on this method itself, and do you think it's still the best method we have to study these issues? Are there any kind of pitfalls to this method, kind of beyond, obviously we can't include everybody in our typologies, but I wonder if you could just comment a bit on this method, because I'm just kind of curious about this. It's also something I use in my own research. Yeah, I think those are my my questions. I apologize if there are too many, but I think the ones that really the question I'm really most curious about is just I really want to hear, because I think this many questions, I think the answers are in the book, and I think the one thing that I really want to know is for you as a scholar of memory, what are some of the lingering, questions and unresolved mysteries and puzzles? And I think that's perhaps will be, the most helpful to all of us in this room. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ding and Dr. Mackevich, and for nice introduction and thoughtful review. So you don't have to apologize for careful reading and also thoughtful response. That's actually the biggest prize for any author. So I appreciate that, really appreciate that. So let me just start with your methodological question, which could be a nice way to lead to other questions. So I give you sort of a very brief narrative about how I actually entered the field, how I became interested in this topic, and how I approached people, and some of the methodological thoughts when I was doing the interview and I was doing the research as well. But first, let me do some shameless self-promotion. On December, I will talk with Stockholm University about those methodological issues, specifically about doing interviews and also typology and theorizing through interviews. That might be more technical one, which contains a lot of technical details. But here, I want to sort of give you a retrospective narrative about why I'm interested in this. So first, you probably, those of you who have read the book and knew that the book was dedicated to my mom. And so I have this personal history behind this book. I grew up in the her Sandown place for 6 years until she returned to the city. So that was sort of a personal imprints on my mind. I'm always interested in her personal history and also the people like her and what they think about the past. Although my mom is completely apolitical, one of the categories that, she doesn't really care about the political questions at all. And when I was showing the book and to my mom, what she really cares is my son wrote his second book and then showing off on WeChat and stuff like that. Doesn't really care about what the argument is and stuff like that. So that's basically the personal history. And then I started to think about this project when I was still in graduate school. At the time, my advisor told me that in addition to your dissertation, you need to have a side project. So when you go up for tenure review, you can show to the committee that you have something like ongoing, right? So, and then you need to start now, do some pilot research, and then you don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but keep thinking and keep doing some pilot research, 1 or 2 or 3 interviews and collecting some textual data. So I actually followed his advice and started this project because that one is always in my mind. So how I actually approach those people, I approach them through my personal networks in Shanghai, because my sites, I have multiple sites, but most important sites for me at the time were Shanghai and Sichuan for the first book, and Shanghai is always my base. So I contacted some interviews as individuals, as you said, that, but suddenly I realized that they were not actually individuals. They were individuals acting in groups. So they have very regular group activities, which was one surprise to me. Second surprise is that when I was talking to them, I was expecting that they would talk about the solidarity among the zhiqing generation, because they went down to the, went down as part of a big program and suffered together. So I expect a lot of solidarity and also the identity as we zhiqing and we zhiqing generation, that kind of collective identity, discourses. So, but I was very surprised at the time when started talking, it's all about themselves. Rarely they talked about we, they use I, so you can actually find a pronoun. It's most of the times it's I. So I am doing well. I suffered a lot in the countryside. And even when they are talking about politics, it's mainly about the impacts of the politics on their life courses, their individual life courses, instead of a we. So I was thinking about what does actually collective mean? What does actually individual mean? So in China, if you want to do collective things, that's a kind of dangerous thing to do, because you collect people together, and to do something together that actually would be on the nerve of the government. That was something that the government didn't really want to see, and people sort of consciously didn't use that collective. But in this case, it's more like sort of the intersection between the individual and historical fate of the whole generation. So when I was thinking about, so I have one side, have individuals talking about individual past, and on the other side, I have this huge historical process that involved 17 million people. How do I actually reconcile the two and into one story? At the time, I was sort of starting teaching, and so Social 101, stuff like that. So one of the key texts for Social 101 teaching, at least in the United States, was C.R. Muse's Sociological Imagination, right? But people actually didn't really pay attention to the details of the sociological imagination. Usually loosely use this concept as like a sociological imagination at its face value. But what C.R. Muse actually talked about is to understand individuals life and the meaning of life through looking at the intersection between individual's fate and a historical process. That was kind of a very illuminating for me. So, and I realized that's what I'm exactly looking at. That's talking about the past. This past is shared by 17 million people, that these 17 million people are individuals. And together, they're actually in a sort of, constituting a historical force that changed history and become part of the historical process. At the same time, I was thinking about generation, and I realized before I went to graduate school in the United States, I translated some of Karl Mannheim's writings into Chinese. Still there is still, and you can buy it online and in China, about intelligentsia and particularly about generation, one of his most important pieces, essays. So I reread the piece on generation. I read it at least like 20 times, so was very familiar about this text about, generation units, actual generation position, intelligence, and stuff like that. So I was thinking in these terms, thinking about what is the actual generation, and this generation's fate has been shaped by historical process. That is exactly what Mannheim talks about. But also Mannheim points out, if you take a generation as a unit analysis, you're wrong. Basically, you need to look at the internal variations in this generation. That is actually the essence of his concept, generation units. And even within the generation unit, you always have this nucleus group. That's basically Mannheim's concept, that those people advocated for something or write about something about this generation and to express their response and their thoughts about their common fate. So these things are very, very interesting to me. So I've been thinking about this. And later I encountered Bourdieu and particularly Bourdieu's habitus. And that was the time when I sort of looking for the match between class as a historical concept in China and a class as a sociological concept in general. At the time that I was really struggling about some of the questions you raised about how to pay attention to historical specificities, and also at the same time, you say something new in sociology, right? If you don't say anything new, you didn't get it published. And so that was basically you want to say. But I found something new is that if we put Bourdieu and Mannheim together, and you find something that is very interesting about their socialization process, particularly early formative years, that actually sort of shapes their ideas later. But Bourdieu doesn't really talk about generations so much, and Mannheim doesn't really pay attention to, of course, not possible because Bourdieu was later. So I tried to connect together, and also there was a literature on generation and memory, completely relied on the sort of psychological concept of generation and memory, and asking people, what kind of historical events you can remember. So that was my remembrance in terms of, I was not satisfied with that kind of approach. And to think that, remembering event does not always mean like you can recall something, but also you need to talk about why this event is important for you. In other words, meanings of the event. So all these together, actually at one moment, I believe that I probably got some really interesting idea and I need to start, my project. At the time, my first book was done. So basically I had nothing else to do. And then, why not just start it? And also got a fellowship and from Fudan University and stayed there as a resident scholar for one semester, and then try to, and also to approach those people. I think it's rare you find individuals who do not actually remember the past without, with a group. Let me rephrase that. You rarely find an individual who remembers the past without reference to a group. This in some of the classical writings, in the literature of memory. For example, Hobwalks, right, talks about family, talks about class. There's a chapter about class which has been ignored by many people. So in other words, when they talk about their past, then they're always referring to how their fellow zhiqing in the countryside have been doing now, and also sometimes they actually participated in the commemorative activities. That's even more obvious. So it's a group memory. So at the time I was thinking about this individual and also collective dichotomy. I find there's a problem that it needs some medium level or meso level, that you cannot just link individual to collective memory. So I divide them into like 3 levels. One is what we call collective memory. That is memory in the collective representations in cultural products such as movies, memorials, and literature. And the second level is sort of a meso level group and community memory, or if you want to use Young Osman's concept, as a communicative memory. In other words, you communicate with each other. Memory actually is enacted in your interaction and also in your talk with other people. You talk with the people. Let's say, a family gathering together looking at pictures about, the child's past. That's basically the communicative memory. Or a community of people, let's say veterans, and gather together and to celebrate their anniversaries and stuff like that. That's communicative memory, or community group level memory. And then you have the individual memory, which are the individual stories about the past. So these things together, so it's mainly my analytical levels. At the time, I was a little bit conscious about, looking for memory at these 3 levels to see if there's discrepancy, if there's something that is lost in the translation process from individual to communicative, or from communicative to collective memory. Of course, I found in the book, I said that, despite the variation in individual memories, all kinds of thoughts about the past, at a collective memory level, you only see this prevailing pattern that is called people, but not event, right? So in other words, the suspending the discussions and the controversies about the past, but at the same time, you celebrate the people, which was sort of a solution that is equivalent to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, but it was different. Later, if we have time, we're going to talk about that. Actually, I made a lot of comparisons in the book. So this is how I approach. And then later, I use, so the question is very important you raise in the end, that you are approaching some people, but you're studying 17 million, right? How is that possible? I want to say that the only way to find the representative samples is to do survey. That's the only way. But it's technically impossible and also politically impossible in China to do research like that, to do a survey about Shandong youth. But the way I approach those people are guided by a different question. Is not really to get a representative answer, but to find out what's out there. What are the patterns of memory out there, without asking the question whether the patterns, how many people actually remember in this pattern. So in other words, it's not a representative question. It's a question that maximizes variations, and to look at the ways that people are reacting to the past, and also to find out the mechanism without actually looking at the representations. So that's basically what I thought. And also this question, if we want to talk about, and we can go on for like 2 hours about qualitative and quantitative and stuff. And so again, if you're interested then you can attend my Stockholm University talk in December I can send you the link at the time. So the specific method I'm using is, there are two methods. Actually, one is called sequential interviewing, and the other is the theorizing agenda based on pragmatism. So the essence of this way of recruiting and doing interview is to traveling back and forth between the cases and the theory, and also treating every case as a case instead of a sample. So we need to abandon the concept and language of sampling or something like that. Instead, we need to think about everyone is a case. So it's a case study logic based on the sequential interviewing. So that was my short answer to your question. But again, it's which method you use is actually guided by your questions. And also ethnography is relatively easy to understand. You need to play out the nuances at the local level. And also in the last two chapters of group memories, I also try to maximize the variation to look at how many people are, how many groups are there, what they think about, and then find out, not everyone is nostalgic. Some people are protesting. Some people are, certainly celebrating singing Mao songs now, but also other people just don't care, just want to be happy together and stuff like that. So there are variations in the details, and also variations in the interviews. So that's basically the question about methodology. So this actually leads us to your very first question about how do I arrive at my typology, right? So I can share screen of one of my slides, I think. I'm sorry, it's way back here. All right, I believe that everyone can see it. So this is basically when I was doing several pilot interviews, when I was thinking about the intersection between individual fate and the historical process. So I think about, people's personal biography and history. So I read every interview very carefully, and to think about the part that this person talks about his or her individual memory, and also the part that he or she talks about history. Of course, as you can imagine, sometimes or most of the times, it's all intertwined with each other. For example, you hear stories like, in December 1968, after Mao's highest imperative, I had to go to Anhui because I had no choice. If I didn't go to Anhui, my dad's job would be halted, and he would go to so-called workshop, study shop, and things like that, which is a euphemism of more like a forced on leave without pay and stuff like that. And also it's the humiliation and all these kind of a forcible mechanisms to force people to go down to the countryside. So you can see in those narratives that on the one hand, you have stories about the historical process. And on the other hand, you can see how individuals react to the historical process. And this person would say, like, I'm not 100% enthusiastic, but at the same time, I really want to go out, didn't really want to idle at home because that was 1968. Red Guards had been demobilized. And also most of the people who were wanderers, who stay home for a long time, really didn't want to stay home again. It's more like you're taking online courses now. You didn't really want to stay with your mom and dad want to go back to campus. And also traveling at the time, it was a luxury for most people. So traveling outside to see what's going on, it was a big desire from this generation. And also it's stratified. This kind of desire is stratified. In the book, I talked about those from working class families. One concern is that if I go down, particularly to farms and military farms, I can earn some wages, which could be very helpful for my family. So I don't have to rely on my parents, I can live on by my own. So that was a big concern too. So it's kind of a mixture that of motives that determine their reaction to the process. And also, of course, you have people who are really enthusiastic about going down, believe this is just a revolutionary pilgrimage. But even those people who have some thoughts about, their future, sometimes they confess that, I thought about maybe I can make something in the countryside, some achievements, and then later could have better credentials, for my career and stuff like that. So it was kind of a mixture. So individuals, are complex, and the human nature is complex. So at the time, I was thinking about how to actually sort of unpack this complexity. So I was thinking of the historical evaluation and also personal evaluation, that is about their personal experience. And so this is not really something from my mind, but from their mind. In the very first several interviews, as I mentioned, that they always talk about themselves. And also they always talk about how am I doing now in terms of social economic status. In other words, if I'm better off now, I probably have a more optimistic and also sunny, upbeat story to tell. If I'm not well off, and I would probably have more blaming in the personal experience. So I found that, wow, that's a big actually discovery, which was not really mentioned. Of course, Hobwalks talked about it in his book, but it's not really in empirical research. And then check some of the major textbooks, the major introductions of collective memory, and found that a class is not in the index. That was an interesting way. That was interesting discovery. And also certainly you find some of the sporadic studies about class and the memory, and in particular like history workshop movement, but it's not really about the class as a variable that actually varies across different class positions and to explain past. So at the time I was really excited, but later after a year, I was frustrated because the class in the sense of a social economic status, that is the conventional definition of class, doesn't actually explain their evaluation of the send-down program as a historical event. And also it doesn't explain their views about the cultural evolution of the Mao years in general. So I was really frustrated at the time and think about bye-bye this project, and probably will end this pretty soon, and it doesn't turn out to be very interesting. But later, some of the interviewees spend a lot of time talking about how they grew up in their families. My father was a high-ranking official, but before the Cultural Revolution, he was purged. And then later I was labeled as black kids, and stuff like that. In the Cultural Revolution, I suffered a lot until 1971. My father was rehabilitated and things like that. And then all people actually turn their faces to me. It's a smiling face instead of this very stone face to me. So how fluctuation of people's fate is, that kind of narrative always occurred again in their narratives. So in Chinese term, it's 出生, or you can say 成分. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, although strictly speaking, they're two different things. So it's important. And I think that 出生 is a historical concept that can be used as a one very distinctive class concept to think about this issue. So I want to say that this is where history and theory actually meet. So on the one hand, you have class concept that you take for granted, that is, socioeconomic status. But on the other hand, you find that a class could be defined very differently in different historical contexts. So at the time I was looking through all these literature on the Mao years class literature. There's a huge literature there. And all of them point out that class is not only socioeconomic status, but sometimes it's kind of a reversal of the conventional understanding. It's a political categorization. The more socioeconomic capital you have, you probably are lower in the Maoist ranking of class. So that's more like a reverse. And I was curious how those actually Black kids or red kids grew up in this kind of class situation, and how that growing up situation sort of shapes their understanding of what's going on at the time, and also what's going on later, 40-something years later, to look at it Maoist. That's basically how I arrived at the class category, which let me just show it. So class in the present, and which means basically the socioeconomic status of the person now, and class in the past is basically their class positions in the Mao years. And then some of you probably know that the habitus is a concept that links class to actual action. And also habitus is formed in people's response to the class structural conditions. Instead of a habitus is given, that's not Bourdieu's idea. Bourdieu's idea is basically everything in the practice. And it's certainly sort of determined by your class positions, but it depends on how you respond to the class position. So that's Bourdieu's idea. I think this gives people sort of leeway or agency in terms of responding to the very stringent class position at the time in the Mao years. Because in contrast to some of the 1984 style portrayal of the Mao years, people at the time still have some agency. You can just stay home and did not actually enjoying some of the political activities. Of course, you do not have the freedom to say, like, I oppose this kind of, chaos and something is wrong. That's Yuroke's, tragedy. But you can say nothing and stay home, playing violin or making radio or doing all kinds of things. So these people are xiao yao pei. So there are people like indifferent to all these political requirements and also the incentives for them to move upward in terms of the class mobility defined at the time by the class, political class categorization. So this is more like a 2x2 table. I know that political scientists and sociologists like 2x2 table. This is more like a conventional trick for the people, but it's something that is not really born in my head. It's actually born in their minds. That they talked about good children and bad children all the time, and also talk about how I make efforts to perform really well to catch up with my good children people. So that was one big thing when I was thinking about all these interviews. So in other words, when you were born into a Black family and you feel like you're smart enough and hardworking enough, but you lost all the opportunities for upward mobility. You felt unsatisfied, but you keep doing what you're doing and feel that one day that I can be rewarded by this system. But in the end, you're not rewarded by the system, and your whole habitus actually changed in the end, particularly after at some historical moments, such as after Lin Biao's death and after Cultural Revolution, and also later in 1989 and so on and so forth. So all these are more like thinking about theory and typology in historical context. So later I actually practiced some of the exercises with my students. My students and college students, their grandmas are from that generation. So I asked them to ask your grandpa and grandma their views about the Cultural Revolution and about the send-down youth and so on and so forth. And then use this typology and to sort of define where they are. So it was quite successful. Most of my students said that my grandpas or grandmas are in withdrawal. In other words, from not so great children, but indifferent to politics and just stay away from politics and doing nothing at all. Just don't want to talk about it. And so that was actually the majority of the people. A few students actually were, their parents were like aspirants, and not many are faithful read. But among my interviewees, because I deliberately sort of looking for people who actually can satisfy the two dimensions, if I can just hear that one dimension is the political capital that is chosen and the political performance. So I told my key informants, look, you look for those people who actually from good chosen family and also quite active in their years in the countryside or during the Cultural Revolution. So my key informants found those people for me, specific type of people for me, and then to ask what their views and so on and so forth. And I also asked my key informants to look for those people who are better off, or unsatisfying conditions, living conditions today. And some of the interviewees certainly I encountered during my ethnographic work. And then later, why don't we just have an interview and stuff like that, or have a chat? I don't say like interview. Fontaine in Chinese is too formal. So I basically say like, let's have a chat or have a drink. And many of the interviews were conducted on dinner tables, or when we have like a baijiu, high sort of alcohol, liquors and stuff like that. So when you have like 2 cups of liquor, and then you become more honest at the time. So that was basically the typology I arrived at. So, and also I think you raised another very interesting question about a positive, negative view about the past, and also how do I know their views at the past in the past, and also the view now, right? I think this is a very interesting methodological question. That is, since I'm speaking to memory scholars here, that is memory as data and memory as a subject. So in other words, when you're studying memory, you're using memory for 2 purposes. One is to use memory for oral history purposes, to sort of find out what actually happened at the time, how did people feel at the time. On the other hand, you pay a lot of attention to the narrative feature of their stories. In other words, they probably reconstruct the past through their narratives. The traditional scholarships are separate, oral historians and then memory scholars, right? Memory scholars are more like a constructive, and oral historians are more like looking for historical truth. But now the boundaries are getting blurred in many of the studies on both camps, that oral historians also talked about, the constructive nature of, oral history, but also memory scholars use interviews to look for what the data about what happened at the time as a sustaining evidence for memory study. So I guess it's less constructive or productive to say like the 2 things are completely separate. But when you're doing research, I think there are still some techniques you can use when you're very clear about your ideas, that I'm asking a question about what do you feel then, or I'm asking a question, how do you view? And one of the interesting ways to think about is that, when they talked about how they felt at the time, you keep asking them, this is how you felt at the time, or this is how you feel now? They will say, oh, this is how I felt absolutely back then. And then they will show you some evidence, pictures and, stuff like that. And then some of them would say like, well, actually now I'm thinking very, very differently. Because at the time I have this self-awakening moment that I realized that everything is different. Of course, the self-awakening, you can say this is constructive, but at the time you think about this narrative as a coherent whole, you need to implant something like a self-awakening into the story to tell the story about yourself. And that is something I'm interested in. It's not really that what happened at the time, but what actually the perceived past in this sort of a narrative construction of the past. So again, this methodological and theoretical question can be, discussed further. We can write another book. There's a book about it. It's an edited volume about memory as subject, memory as I can't remember the title, but there's a book about that. Oral historians and also memory scholars. Of course, people in the audience may have other insights about this. Do I talk too much? All right. So one thing, your third question is very interesting. It's about individuals' tendency to depict a picture about a positive image about themselves, right? Which actually is very common, that when you tell a life story, you tend to be very positive. Even you're not doing well now, you probably blame others. That's pretty understandable. It's very common. It's a universal. But your question is, actually some people talked about what they did wrong, and even some of the evil things they did. A few of them did, only a few of them. One of them actually is in the book, Mr. I can't remember the pseudonym, but the person who was beating his teacher in the first several years of the Cultural Revolution, that he confessed and later apologized. But so few people confessed about what they did, already told us something about their about the history part and also about the personal experience part. Some people deliberately, I can feel that some people deliberately actually skip the part about the first several years of the Cultural Revolution and directly skip to the Shandong years and talk in a very excited way that for like 2 hours. So I wait this person to pick the ones they're most excited about to tell, and then to get them excited. Later, I ask you questions about, so let's go back to the early years of the Cultural Revolution, what you did and in culture, 1966 and 1967. And then this person will become less interested in talking about all these chaos. And some people say, oh, it's just luan, it's a chaos, it's a turmoil, and the school stops and that's it. And so I keep asking, and until they felt really uncomfortable about. Sometimes I did ask that, did you actually beat the teachers as you can expect it? Of course not. I wasn't one of them, right? They actually beat the teachers and did all these horrible things. And I asked them, what about you? And then they were like, yeah, I'm just looking. I was young, and some of them were really young, like 13 years old and 14, 15 years old. But others at the time is already high school students, 16 and 17. And according to our historical knowledge, these students were actually the actual major force that actually created the chaos in the first 2 years of the Cultural Revolution. So this part is fairly fuzzy in terms of the boundary between what happened at the time and what you remember. Of course, what I'm interested in this book is not to sort of not a quest to look at the historical truth, but how they perceive the past. So this kind of a hesitance says something about why they chose the identity label, zhiqing identity label, instead of red guards. Nobody wants to identify themselves as red guards, except a few. One of them actually was the first one in chapter 1, the first individual story, who was really proud about this his conflicts in the first several years, and he got injured and sent to emergency room and stuff like that. He was really proud about this all these things that, so in his narrative, what he did in schools before Sandown is very consistent to what he did later during Sandown. So that's a very coherent narrative. And he didn't feel sorry for that, and he didn't feel guilty for what he did. So that was sort of variations. Again, this actually speaks to one of the central arguments of the book, is that generation label has been carefully chosen by this generation to call themselves. Despite the heavy overlapping between Red Guard experience and also the Sandown youth generation. But of course, some of them were sent down before the Cultural Revolution. They were already adults. For example, those people went to Xinjiang from Shanghai. They were adults during the Cultural Revolution, and most of them were not really politically active at the time because in those remote areas. A few of them active because Xinjiang, if you know history, that actually is one of the first places where armed conflicts happened during the Cultural Revolution. And the conflicts were pretty serious at the time. So that was basically the answer to your question. To the question about the negative view about the past. I can decipher my own notes. Okay, so basically, you're asking about the asymmetry between the people who are doing well and people who are not doing well today, right? It seems that it's easy to imagine that people are doing well today have a sort of upward mobility story to tell. That's fairly universal. Some of the oral histories of Americans and other places are already actually corroborate this kind of upward mobility thing, a redeemable past. That past suffering has been redeemed into today's success. So it's in President Xi Jinping's personal narrative as well. For those people who are not doing well today, the variations are huge. Some of them blame the historical process, and others are not actually blaming those historical process. And even when they are attributing their suffering to bigger causes, they actually choose the objects of attribution. For example, one of my interviewees in chapter 2 said that I'm not blaming Mao, I'm blaming them. In other words, blaming the reformists who actually abandoned all the good things in the Mao years, right? The so-called universal healthcare, which is not true, historically, that thing that never existed in China. And also how the factories took care of his father when his father was ill. But also, I have a note on that, is only for SOE factories. In other words, state-owned enterprises. Instead of all the factories, or peasants are basically not really enjoying this kind of benefits. So it's mainly that you can see he actually blamed the reformist government for some good reasons. One is the reform, particularly in the 1990s, the dismantling of the SOEs in China actually resulted in the downward mobility of many of the workers. And he himself was basically a downward story from his father's secure status as workers, as not only economically, but also politically. Worker is one of the red categories. So that kind of downward mobility, he was blaming the reformers, and particularly the Shanghai government and stuff like that. So it depends on a lot of factors which I laid out in the chapter. And also there's several interesting cases that even when they know that they were moving downward, they rhetorically reshaping their stories into an upward mobility story to say, like, I don't really care how much money I earn now. I really care about how, this X could be invented. I'm a good person. I contribute to the society. I'm a nice person. I always volunteer in the community. Or in one case that this woman says that I actually loves cooking. I raise turkeys, and in the land I rented from the peasants. I really love my life, and I was a kind of lifestyle person, and those professors don't have this kind of taste and this kind of thing. So it's interesting, more like a reversal of the real social mobility. If you're a sociologist, you know that Michelle Lamont, who is a prominent sociologist at Harvard now, and she has interviews with I think it is upper middle class people in both France and also in the United States. And she talks about several cases of this reversal sort of a narrative as well. So it's more like a reshaping the thing. But at the same time, those interviewees and told me how much money they earn, and also the at least in the surveys that they didn't actually lie or things like that. And sometimes I paid all the dinners, and for those people that still believe that they're upper class or upper middle class. So it's very funny, interesting sort of experience, and to look at how people perceive their past. So I want to say, like, if I can conclude this sort of the not doing well peoples, I would say it certainly it varies. And the second is not everyone perceives the past suffering as suffering. And third is even they perceive the past suffering as suffering, they attribute to different kinds of political forces, institutions, and then people. And you mentioned gender, and a few women actually started their stories with blaming their husbands. And also they talked about, I made a mistake, terrible, terrible mistake in the countryside because I married to the wrong person, things like that. So it was interesting to see that how actually different, people who perceive the so-called upward and downward in different ways. For many female interviewees, the success or not is very, the success or not in career is very tied to their family life. But that kind of a tie actually decreases when the woman's socioeconomic status increases. So for those high-ranking officials or successful entrepreneurs who are also women, they rarely talked about their family life. So that's a very interesting way. So this is actually one of the lingering issues you talked about. I wish I could have put more emphasis on gender. And I believe this is a very interesting way to think about class and gender in the Mao years and today. But I only add one section, and an observation of this tie is still limited. So it's one thing that actually later I probably can pursue. So what else? Oh, there are historical specificity about those people class in the Mao years. And you raised the question about class categories and their fluctuations during the whole Mao years. Of course, that's there. And I also, in the book, I talked about, class categorization is more like a dynamic process. Instead of once or a set is there, that's not true. And I cited Gao Hua, who is the late historian who are highly respected. And he has a very wonderful article about class and Chushen in the Mao years. So in other words, even you are a high-ranking official, if you are purged in 1957 in the anti-rightist movement or anywhere between 1949 to 1966, you are probably, in a very different fate. And you gave your children a very different kind of a family situation, that they grew up in a situation that have quite a different conception about themselves and also about the world. For example, President Xi Jinping was one of the examples, and his father was purged before the Cultural Revolution. So in the first several years, he was suffering from all kinds of attacks when he was in Beijing. He almost died in there, and then escaping Beijing to Shanxi was sort of a more sort of life-saving situation for him. And then he performed really well in the countryside and was recommended for college to Tsinghua University. But at the time, you think about historical specificity, there's one thing that is, one specificity I took into consideration when I categorized them is that those children whose parents got purged in the first several years of the Cultural Revolution and then got rehabilitated very soon in 1970, in 1971. And I still categorize them as red because, you know, they actually suffered a little bit, but it didn't affect the opportunities of mobility in their life. So there are several criteria to think about where they are in terms of structural conditions of a class. One is that did they actually lose any opportunities because they have chosen, or did they actually or were they labeled as some people that actually experience humiliation and things like that. So there's some fuzziness in there that the people, of course, several of my interviewees, I spent a lot of time, 2 hours, about how they were humiliated for several years of the Cultural Revolution when they went, sent down to the countryside and people looked down upon them, discriminated against them because their parents were purged in 1966. And then later in 1971, their parents were rehabilitated. So people changed their faces and changed their attitude and given them all the opportunities. And those people were very, very likely to change their habitus. In other words, they saw the dark side and the bright side in this kind of a personal fate because of their chosen. And then they have very conscious idea about politics at a micro level. So these interviews are very interesting to look at. And also some of them, and you can see that they change their habitus, even their faithful red. But these cases are pretty rare among the faithful red. The more likely you have those people who are aspirant from Black chosen and then later try to perform very well, but didn't get rewarded from the system and then change their habitus. So it's statistically, and I present in the book, they are the group more prone to habitus change, and their reflections on the Mao years were deeper than others. And then some of them are pretty successful. Even they're successful, they would say like, what didn't destroy me made me stronger. So it sounds like a Taylor Swift song, right? But it's the emphasis is on the first part, that is what didn't destroy me. In other words, what happened in the Cultural Revolution is something that is really bad, and it's a force that we cannot change, we didn't choose, and things like that. So that answers your question. As for your big question, lingering issues, that's a very good question. There are too many lingering issues pertaining to memory in my mind. One of them is gender, I already talked about. Another thing is that when I was doing research on this project and other projects as well, I was thinking about, those people who remain silent. In other words, when you approach people and then call them and text them, and then they say, okay, and they are the people who actually want to talk to you, right? And you can say these people are self-selected people. And one of my friends actually questioned my selection, and in the very beginning of the project, that you end up getting all these successful people, the winners. But in the end, you can see lots of my people who are not really successful, some of them. But these are the people also wanted to air their grievances and express their own dissatisfaction, and also trying to blame someone. And sometimes they have some purposes to ask me to do something. I actually talked about that in my ethnographic narratives. But at the same time, when I finished the book, I'm still not very satisfied with the book, but you already got the book down, and no book is perfect. And if you keep doing this, you probably would write about this book forever. So I just finished it. But one lingering thing is that, what about those people who remain silent? What kind of effort should we take to approach them and get them talk? And what if they really don't want to talk? At the same time, this actually speaks to a bigger question about silence and forgetting. So when we are talking about those people who do not really want to talk or do not talk, and we assume, or at least I actually refer to memory scholars, we assume that something is forgotten, right? But that statement is questionable. And because, you never know people, whether people are still remembering, but really don't want to talk about it, or still people who are remembering want to talk about it, but don't have the opportunities to talk about it. And we have the people who really don't know the event itself, and then don't have anything to talk about it. So all of these variations are underneath this service of silence that we actually don't have methodological and theoretical tool to unpack. So this actually leads to my sort of second memory project, is about Tiananmen, silence on Tiananmen. And also maybe I would, sort of retrospectively talk about the Cultural Revolution as well. We know that from many wonderful studies by, Andrew Water and by Su Yang, and also historians, and we know that millions of people suffered during the Cultural Revolution and in the Mao years. Some people just don't talk for various reasons. And also, one of the things that I mentioned in the book is that, it's still very much, the book is still very much a zhiqing-centered narrative, which I regret about it. But I have no way to solve this problem. So this could be one of the drawbacks of the book. And if you criticize me, I'm okay, I'm very delighted. It's just one of the problems. And what is actually really forgotten, what is silent, are the peasants in the countryside, particularly those peasants in the villages. So the send-down movement, the people were sent on to two different kinds of destinations. One is to farms, which is collectively managed, and the other is to villages. So they're very, very different life situations. Farms are short of labor, while villages there's a surplus of labor everywhere in China. So it was an extra burden for the people who already in the villages, who are peasants. So the peasants' view about zhiqing could be completely the opposite. Those really hungry teenagers who actually didn't know how to do field work and come down and stole our chicken, slept with our daughters, and then things like that. And then after 6 years, and then they went back to cities and then wrote novels and essays talking about their suffering. And the peasants were like, what? Is this for suffering? And we have been suffering like this for hundreds of years, and it's always like that. And then you stay here for only 6 to 10 years, and then you talk about suffering. But it's more seriously that it's still a very much a zhiqing centered narrative. Of course, I wouldn't deny that many of them in this generation were suffering, and that suffering is still continuing, as I mentioned in the book. And if you go to Shanghai every Wednesday morning, and outside Labor Bureau, you see the protesters and still demanding social welfare policies to be adjusted for those people, right? But on the other hand, one big omission in the book is not much from peasants. And in other words, those silent people. Of course, that every book has its perspective. So I wish in the future, maybe it's just compensated by the future work instead of the previous work. That in the future, I will dig deeper into the silent people instead of those people who are willing to talk or very eager to talk, and they have something to say, but about those people who are more silent, for various reasons. I think I would there's one question about evaluation of politics. Is that right? So the current politics. Yeah, I would say that although I didn't actually make it very explicit, but you can see from like the last 2 chapters, there are groups of zhiqing who wholeheartedly supported the President Xi Jinping's political agenda. So at the time when they went on a trip, which was more like a commercial trip plus some revolutionary pilgrimage idea, but they named the trip as a One Belt, One Road, which was on the Xi Jinping's agenda. That was the infrastructure project in overseas places for Xi Jinping. Now it's kind of declining very sharply after 2018. But in my field experience, everywhere I went, I saw Xi Jinping's portrait. So it was more like justification of the activities. I would interpret this in 2 ways. One is many of them wholeheartedly supported Xi Jinping. They're Xi Jinping supporters and their followers. They are proud of Xi Jinping, that finally our generation has a leader, not just one leader. You have Li Keqiang and other people are also China's top leaders. On the other hand, it's more like a self-defense safety mechanism. Because in China, if you gather together more than 40 people there, so you have to apply for approval from the Public Security Bureau that you can gather together. And then you have Xi Jinping's portrait in the middle or in the visible places that actually justify your gathering. So several of them actually told me that the Public Security Bureau or even National Security Bureau actually went to their activities and observed for a few times and found that all the songs and the dances and the words are mainly like a positive energy stuff, which means that it's following the official lines and giving more positive evaluation of the past. Even some great stuff in there, but it's not really so much. So, and then those public security people stopped attending. So it was a big relief for them. So that was a sort of a pragmatic solution that running those activities in China. So those people, I wouldn't say that they're stupid. They're not stupid. They're very, very versed at some of the techniques of surviving in China. And also I actually, one of the best quotes from my interview is with a manager of a museum. I really want to share with you. It actually sums up many of the things. Let me see if I can get it here. Sorry. Okay. All right. This person says, basically what they're doing the interviews mainly following a theory that is called survival on the surface. We shouldn't be satisfied with the green. So he actually analogized the museum to the green. So we do not want to dig deep because we all know that there are broken stones underneath the green. So our job is to make the green more beautiful. And people come to the museum, and because there are hotels and other facilities around the museum, come here to have a place to stay, eat, and have fun. After all, the send-down program, and he knows that, the send-down program is a scar on the body of the Communist Party, and you do not want to peel it off to expose the bloody flesh. If you do that, it is impossible to run the museum. So they know the political risk, and they carefully manage to to make the activities more politically correct. So this is why even the individual memories are so differential, but in the end, all the memories converged into one big pattern that is people but not event, without talking about the event itself, but talking about the people. And the people is mainly in the positive light. So I guess I will stop here, and then it's a really long sort of an answer. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful response. I think I just want to see if there are people in the audience or in the room who want to just raise their questions, and let's perhaps get a conversation going.
Just a small remark. Many thanks to Professor Xu. Actually, it seems that we are limited with time, and we have only from 10 to 15 minutes. So please, for those who are going to ask questions, please try to keep them short. It seems that we have about 15 minutes because one of our speakers is quite limited with time. Well, Isa, can you see?
Oh yeah, I can. Yeah, go ahead.
No. Can you see any questions in the chat box?
In the chat box, no. But I would just
raise hand.
Yeah, just go ahead.
Okay. I have a very short question. Thank you very much for the lively discussion and a very inspiring one. I was just wondering whether one could have noticed a significant difference in between how those four categories that Professor Xu describes, this aspirant withdrawal, the indifferent threat or faithful threat, whether there are any differences of how they refer to traumatic memory, they remember traumatic events.
Yeah, of course. These are all about traumatic events. Unless the people who actually didn't experience traumas at all. For example, some of the faithful red say like, I didn't experience anything, or some indifferent red that said that I didn't know other people suffering until after the whole thing is done and I watched the TV series and I know, oh my God, those people actually suffered a lot. So I would say that it depends. It's more like, in our situation, in today's world, if you are privileged and the socioeconomic status is high, you actually think the world is pretty good, and then you didn't really care about the so-called distant suffering of other people, right? You believe that the world is there because you don't have this consciousness that goes beyond the scope that is a result of a socialization. But for the people who actually slide it down to the bottom of the social hierarchy, I think the trauma is still there. I don't know what kind of traumatic events you refer to. I think for some of them, the trauma was basically, trauma was basically the suffering of their parents in the first several years of the Cultural Revolution. And one of my interviewees, whose parent was a Fudan University professor and committed suicide in 1967, I think. And then also the trauma could also refer to their own experience in the countryside, and particularly for those people who went to Xinjiang and before the Cultural Revolution, because the material conditions there were just horrible, living more like a, semi-underground places. In the local expression, it's called 地窝, it's more like digging a hole into the ground and then you live in the hole, that kind of thing. So I guess, yeah, so they responded to the trauma events, traumatic events in different different ways. And some people surprised me by not really remembering any horrible things from the Cultural Revolution, particularly some working class kids at the time. They actually had a lot of fun in the Cultural Revolution.
Thank you. Any other questions, or if there is any follow-up questions on this?
Actually, maybe I have a very short question about the official, so-called official or state memory politics in China towards the Cultural Revolution. Is there any official statements about these events?
Yeah, there are several statements, but it fluctuated slightly over time. When Deng Xiaoping came to power in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the official statement was basically quite negative about the Cultural Revolution, because for the new regime's legitimacy, it's better to say like the past wrongs are just horrible, and now I'm gonna make effort to correct those wrongs. But the so-called correction was limited as well. And later, when the top leaders at the time in the 1980s found that people try to discover too much about what happened in the past, and then to say like, stop, no, we are not doing it. Just let the past, just bygones be bygones, and that kind of a the attitude. But overall, I think the top leaders in China for several generations mainly have a very negative view about the Cultural Revolutions. But until Xi Jinping was pretty vague, not so explicitly negative. On some occasions, he certainly said something like Cultural Revolution is just a tragedy, or some others. But on other occasions, he used roundabout ways to say like, look, the Mao years are not all wrong, they're good things. So he had a very famous statement about 30 years versus 30 years. So if you divide the recent Chinese history by 1979, that was from 1949 to 79, that was the economic reform. And then the first set of 30 years. And then 1979 to 2009, the second 30 years. And he said that we cannot use the first 30 years to deny the achievement of the second 30 years. But there's another sentence that is, we cannot use the achievement of the second 30 years to deny the achievement of the first 30 years. So it's more like a seemingly symmetrical evaluation of the periods. But if you put the words into context, you know that previous leaders have very explicit sort of attack and condemnation of Cultural Revolution. And he said that, no, there's 30 years, treat them equally. It's more like, all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter, that kind of thing, the rhetorical trick. So I would say that, yeah, it's been hotly debated among, public commentators about Xi Jinping's attitude toward the Cultural Revolution. So in the end of the book, I actually explained this by his, where he is in the full box, and he's basically either, in the sort of the faithful red, or in the aspirant, more aspirant than faithful red, because his father was purged before the Cultural Revolution, and he performed really, really hard, and also got very handsome rewards from the system. And later his career was basically in context where self-reflections and self-criticisms are simply not possible. After he graduated from Tsinghua, and he went to the military directly, and then became provincial officials. And so this kind of life trajectory was not really conducive to any kinds of self-criticisms or reflections. So it's not a surprise, even if you think I'm right on these types. So of course, it's more complex than what the journalists say about Xi Jinping. it's not that simple that he wanted to be Mao, or he's one of the Chairman Mao's children. I would say that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Would you say that so speaking of trauma, because the question about trauma really got me thinking, would you say that, so in my own research, I have a little paper that's on this very issue of kind of Maoist nostalgia. And then what we found was that nostalgia and trauma kind of coexist in the memories. Yep. And it was quite clear that, people, actually many of the respondents, some of them have kind of overwhelming positive or negative view toward the past or recollection of the past, but some of them, would kind of talk about both the nostalgic part and the traumatic part. And I think that's why your book was clarifying to me, because maybe one way for me to think about as I revise this paper is to say, are these two things kind of maybe correspond to either the personal and the political, or perhaps there are kind of two dimensions to that?
Yeah, I would say yes. So I would say like nostalgia is basically a representation of your habitus in its individual sense, that you grew up with some songs and movies and some expressions. When you grow old, like me now, aging, when I think about my favorite song, it's all suddenly realized that it's 20 years ago. So, so my daughter was like, these are just, old songs, and, we want BTS and stuff like that. But in 30 years, BTS becomes something like my Beatles or beyond and things like that, right? So I would say like, yeah. So, and also I think the dilemma is here that you really don't want, many people really don't want to go back to the Mao years. But when they try to say something or comment on something, they unconsciously bring up those things in their cultural repertoire, which was actually instilled into them when they were growing up. So this is what habitus is about. It's more like an unconscious way. I encountered a lot of people who actually absolutely 100% didn't want to go back to the Cultural Revolution, but they went to, when they are doing like a karaoke, that they were singing Mao songs, which actually is less meaningful to, a kind of contradiction between their political views. And then you realize that these are the songs they grew up with. And if you want them not to sing these songs, and what else do they have? So this actually is more like an interesting way. If you from the outsider observe this kind of contradiction, you will believe that, yeah, those older generation people are just the red guards, right? Just the Maoist diehards because they sing red songs. But they actually deny that. We are not Maoist diehards, and we are actually absolutely against the Cultural Revolution and things like that. But people didn't actually have the patience to listen to them. And also this contradiction is always there. The things that you grew up with and also the political views could be, in a very contradictory core. It's a complexity in there. So this is why when they're in this rapidly changing social context in China, that they are getting lost, that what else I can say to prove that we are not regards? Yeah. It's a kind of it's more like a dilemma for this generation.
That is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like we need to stop to interrupt our fascinating discussion because our time is running out. But well, I hope that we can proceed with our discussion maybe for the next events, because yes, we got so many insights and so much inspiration for future thinking about memory collegians in our own studies and countries. So thank you very much for such an exciting discussion. Thank you very much for agreeing to join the discussion, and Professor Dean and Professor Xu. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate very much your insights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing. Thank you, Dr. Dean.
Thank you. Looking forward to future events.
Yeah,
Right.
thank you. Please stay in tune, and we'll disseminate our next announcements.
Well, is there a way to sign up for the seminar, or if there's an email list?
Yeah, sure. I'll add your email into mailing list. Sure.
Yeah.
Dear colleagues, hope to see you next time in November. November 1st will be the next seminar in our series. So please join us next time, and I hope we can proceed with our discussion maybe some other time.
Right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.